2021 continued to be a pretty strange year overall, but for beards and cars I will say it was a very good year. In fact, an even better one than last year was. In 2020, and of course I did a car of the year video for then as well if you want to watch that one, we reviewed 31 cars. This year it was up to 36 cars, and unlike 2020 where there were 0 hot hatches, this year I featured 7, and that was the single biggest area of growth. And many of those hot hatches are actually among my favourite experiences of the year. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with my Car of the Year videos, this is less objective than the reviews and more subjective. This is about the cars that aren't necessarily mathematically the best in all cases, but the experiences and the going above and beyond which each car gave me. The best memories, in other words, of the year, and ranking those in terms of my experience combined with the value for money for potential buyers. So kicking us off first of all in 10th is the Mercedes SL65. I mean, straight off the bat, it's a colossal amount of car for the money. Around 45 grand gets you essentially a Pagani level engine in an otherwise elegant tin top convertible, which can still easily kick it with stuff like Bentleys and Astons in terms of road presence. And I will say, to this day, the SL65 is still the single most intimidating car I've ever driven. I never even came close to using full throttle, and with literally the horsepower of a Zonda and the torque of a Huayra, 1000 Newton meters, it is an absolute monster of a car. Next up in 9th is actually kind of a callback to the 2020 season, because back then I did a review for the Jaguar XJ8 with about 250 horsepower. I really liked the car, but one of the primary things I said in that review was that I wanted to get my hands on the R version with the full 400 horsepower, because I predicted basically that it would have all of the same strong points but even better performance. Well, this year I did review an XJR, and that's exactly how it turned out. It's a typical old man's Jag, of course, but I love the XJR. Everything about it is just understated but fantastic. The air ride suspension is super comfortable, the headroom is fantastic, the space in general, the value for money is insane given how dirt cheap they are, and even though values are beginning to go up, it's still one of the best ways of getting yourself a full-on R-spec Jaguar without paying through the nose for it. Next up in 8th place, I'm putting a vehicle which some people would probably expect to be higher, given the praise I gave it in its own review, and some people, given how successful the review was, more so than most of these episodes are, which was nice to see, some owners will probably be disappointed. The Alfa Romeo Giulia, the Quadrifoglio in particular. This was a phenomenal car. The one I drove was modified, so it was even quicker as well. It literally feels like a DTM touring car on the street. It's an absolutely phenomenal machine, and the biggest praise I can give this car is that to this day, it is probably the single best handling car I've ever driven, including my own Maserati Quattroportes, which are really up there as well in terms of best handling cars out there in my opinion. The reason why it's not even higher on the list is because, as I said, this is very personal to me, and as much as I enjoyed the Giulia, it's not necessarily a car that I feel like I need to drive again. And it's not on my bucket list of vehicles. So I really liked it, I see why people love it, and I definitely found it more enjoyable than the equivalent, for example, BMW M car, but again, it was an experience which was nice as a one-off for me. Next up in 7th, I'm featuring the only car on the list with a manual gearbox. And any of you who know me and my preferences and tastes know that that is really high praise. To be on the list at all, let alone in 7th, a car which had been on my radar for so long, one of my favourite hot hatches ever since it first came out, and I finally got the chance to drive one. Of course I'm talking about the Ford Focus RS, the Mark II in particular. It wasn't lime green, which was the only demerit, but apart from that, it was a great experience. Again, it was modified, but even in its stock form, it's one of the most bonkers hot hatches out there. 300 horsepower going through the front wheels with a manual gearbox. It's a relatively large hot hatch compared to many others on the market as well, which meant that space was fantastic. It's the kind of car that honestly, if the Focus RS came with a DSG gearbox option, which I know many purists would hate, but if it came with that, I would already have one. That's the kind of difference it would make for me. I would 100% own one by now. The fact that it doesn't is unfortunate because I just don't like using manual cars, but even with the manual gearbox, it was easily my favourite manual car I've ever driven, and that includes the Ferrari F355 from this year as well. So again, pretty high praise for a hot hatch. It was a fantastic experience, and it didn't let me down. It was one of those occasions where it was a bucket list car that definitely lived up to it. Next up in 6th was one of the biggest surprises of the year for me because of my previous experience with the company, an Aston. In fact, the DB7. Now the DB7 is a car which I already had next to no interest in, to be honest. I've never been a huge fan of it. And the other Astons that I reviewed, I believe both of which were in the 2020 season, the 2014 Vantage and of course the Vanquish S, one of the most exotic cars I've reviewed so far on the channel, both of them were kind of, I'm sorry, underwhelming to me. They weren't what I was expecting from an Aston. They didn't really have, I don't know, just that certain spark. The DB7 shocked me. It was the 6-cylinder as well, and I had this preconceived notion that it's going to feel too slow, it's not going to be powerful enough. Boy was I wrong. It was great, and as I alluded to in that review, it actually reminded me of a Supra, of all things, which is the last thing I would have expected. That curvy 90s shape, rear-wheel drive with the turbo-aspirated 6-pot unit, around 330 horsepower, 0 to 60 in around the 5–6.5 second range, depending on the Supra or the DB7. And even that little bit of 90s classic turbo lag, the sound it makes, the way it took corners, just across the board they were remarkably similar experiences. Ultimately, the surprise that the DB7 gave me, and the turnaround in my opinion which it gave me, was the most reminiscent car of this entire year to what the Porsche Panamera was for me in 2020, going from a car which I specifically didn't like to absolutely loving it after. Unfortunately, I will never be purchasing a DB7 for one simple reason, and that is that I don't fit in the car properly. It did give me a bad back, and that's such a shame because I pretty much love everything else about it. We now break into the top 5 though, and for those of you who follow the channel, you will of course know that I recently purchased a new car, a Bentley Flying Spur. I didn't in good faith believe that it would be appropriate to feature 2 of my own cars in this year's top 10 though, so that review is going to be the first one of the 2022 season. So if you want to hear a review of the Bentley Flying Spur, then of course stick around on the channel for that. I am featuring my other car from this year though, well technically one of my other cars because I've owned 3 cars in 2020, or 2021 I should say, and that is of course my Maserati, the Quattroporte. But in particular the second Quattroporte. The reason why it's on the list and the reason why it's number 5, which is pretty high, is because this delivered everything I hoped for the first time around. It's the facelifted, updated car with the ZF transmission instead of the Duo Select, and it is worlds better. In every way this car was a better experience than the first one. The condition it was in, the performance, the responsiveness of the engine even with that different gearbox, the fact that it actually has a proper automatic for a start instead of an automated manual, all of these things make such a massive difference. And even though I did get rid of the car recently for my Bentley, I didn't get rid of the Maserati because it broke, unlike the first time. So I still have very fond memories of the car, and again, it delivered everything I wanted from that experience. Plus, let's be honest, reliability worries included, a Quattroporte is still one of the most affordable, genuine exotic cars on the market, period. There are very few other vehicles that can match what it offers for that kind of price. Even something like a Jag isn't quite that exotic. Moving up into number 4 now though, much like the Ford Focus RS, this was a car which I'd wanted to review for the longest time, since I started the entire series really. And, funnily enough, much like the next vehicle on the list, is a vehicle which I enjoyed so much that, kind of like the Jag XKR in the 2020 season, it actually made me kind of go out and buy one, albeit not exactly the same model, and I'm of course talking about the Bentley Continental GTC Speed, the open-top version of the GT in its 600 horsepower form. When it comes to ownership, Bentleys have a ton of horror stories and concerns, and even with my own Spur, of course it suffers from those same potential concerns, but it was driving this GTC that really delivered everything I was hoping it would be. It's my kind of car, as I've said, down to a T, a Continental T, and everything about it just lived up and even exceeded in some ways what I was hoping for. It's big, it's heavy, it's comfortable, but it handles itself remarkably well through corners. There's little to no body roll, it doesn't wallow at all like a Rolls-Royce would, and the performance is just so effortlessly supercar level in its scope. A genuine 200 mile an hour car with a 0 to 60 time that can easily worry stuff like XKRs and Astons despite weighing as much as some SUVs. Just an incredible machine. The varying in price stops it from being higher on the list because for some people they're still very expensive, and that depends on how far you're willing to go on mileage really. Next up in third place though, we talk about the car which I referenced just now, the very first car of the year in fact, another Maserati. The Gran Turismo. This is the car which, much like the Bentley did, causing me to buy a Spur, and much like driving the Jag did in 2020 caused me to buy an XKR myself, this Maserati is what made me buy the Quattroporte, because the Gran Turismo restored my love for Maserati. In 2020, I, of course, well, technically in 2019, bought my own Quattroporte, which was a bad choice, it was a bad car. But I then reviewed a 4200, which also kind of underwhelmed me compared to what I was hoping for, so my love for Maserati was certainly at a dip. Then I drove this Gran Turismo. It was everything a Maserati should be. It had the gothic, elegant, gorgeous looks, the road presence, the handling, the surprising level of comfort given its performance level. It can easily rival your Jag XKs and your Astons, but for sometimes a little bit less price, compared to an Aston at least, the rear seats are bigger than most other GTs, so it's even more practical. The sound was incredible, and the single thing which impressed me the most was that I could immediately feel the difference with that ZF gearbox, and that same 4.2 engine that my own Quattroporte had, which I purchased after. Of course I had some other issues with the Quattroporte thanks to the dealer I bought it from, but that wasn't the car's fault. The Gran Turismo made a huge impression on me, and it remains, as the top 3 placement indicates, one of my absolute favourites of the year. Now though we move into the top 2, and these two were the most difficult for the longest time for me to actually pick one over the other, and they couldn't really be any more different besides the fact that they were both blue. These are such radically different cars, and ironically, I actually drove both of them on the same day. In number 2 though, the Range Rover SVR. Now, to somebody who hasn't driven one, it's going to sound crazy. How on earth could you ever put a Range Rover above half the cars that have already been on this list? Well, that is exactly what I would have said before driving one. The reality is that this is not a Range Rover driver's Range Rover. This is a Jaguar driver's Range Rover. If you love the Jag XKR, then I guarantee you're gonna love the Range Rover SVR, because spoiler alert, it has the same engine. The 503 horsepower supercharged XKR engine, and put that engine into an SUV, you've pretty much made my dream car. Now, I'm still not a Range Rover kind of guy, which is the only thing that holds me back from actually wanting one myself, but across the board, what a machine. 4.5 second 0 to 60 time, endless space, so high up when you're driving it that you feel like you're looking down on houses, and the only real drawback is that these have been criticised for their reliability and build quality, and that is such a shame. Ultimately, the thing which prevented me from putting it in the number 1 spot is the price. Even used, these are like 50 grand cars, and you don't really find them for much less than that, even with higher mileage, so it is a bit prohibitive, whereas many of the others on this list are just categorically great value at much lower prices. However, that doesn't stop the fact that the Range Rover, much like the Aston DB7, was easily one of my biggest surprises of the year. What an incredible machine. What though about number 1? Well, back in 2020, my number 1 was probably a slightly controversial pick, and this one might even be more so. However, for owners of these cars, you're going to know exactly why it's my number 1. The car which I almost sold my Jag XKR for. A car which, after my Bentley, I might actually buy. A Volkswagen Golf R32, the Mark V in particular. Now, of course, this is ridiculous, and no, this is not a joke. This is my car of the year, and hear me out as to why. If you listen to that car and the start of the review. It sounds literally like a mini Maserati. When driving it, it takes corners like nothing else in the year. Yes, I said that the Giulia was probably the best handling car I'd ever driven, objectively speaking, but you know, there's a different category of handling when it comes to hot hatches. A hot hatch isn't dealing with anywhere near as much weight or power as something like a Giulia, but in its own way, this Golf honestly feels like it could run rings around half the other cars on this list. It has a stupidly big engine for a small hot hatch. It's one of the very few hot hatches to have all-wheel drive. It has the option of either a manual or a DSG, so it appeals to everyone. The performance was incredible. The one I drove with a 350 horsepower supercharged engine and essentially a straight pipe. The practicality is spot on, the fuel economy is decent enough to use as a daily, the costs are nothing close to many of the other cars on this list if you need to repair even, or replace something. And even in terms of value for money, that is what gave it the #1 spot. The Ford Focus RS is an amazing machine, but prices are going up. XKR money is what you're going to be paying for a Ford Focus RS, at least 17-18 grand, and some, much like the Renault Clio V6, are up to crazy prices of 50 grand. I believe the Golf R32 is going to go up in value. At the moment, they're pretty reasonable. You can enter the market at about 6 grand, you can pay about 12 or 13 for a great one, or even more if you want hyper low miles. That is not going to stay the same forever. I believe that the Golf R32 is kind of the end of an era before things became all about 2-litre turbos, even within Volkswagen. I think this car is becoming a cult classic. It already is, to people who know how good it is, and I think a renaissance is going to happen to the Golf R32 in the exact same way as it's happened to the Jag XKR. If I have involvement in that, then I will be happy. And as I said, I like this car enough to potentially get one after my Bentley Flying Spur. That should tell you everything you need to know about how amazing this little hot hatch is. Ultimately, that's it for my car of the year and the 9 runners-up as well. Of course, you can check out links to all of these by basically clicking straight through to the Beards and Cars playlist, where every single episode ever is featured. So if you want to check out any of my thoughts further on these, then you can find that there. As far as the rest of this goes, thank you all for an amazing 2021 season of Beards and Cars. I know that many of you enjoy this series as much as I do, and even though it's one of the less successful series on the channel, this is easily my biggest passion on the channel. Gran Turismo, Forza, that kind of stuff, of course, is the bread and butter, but this I consider to be more of my personal hobby side of the channel. Even if the videos don't make money, in fact in some cases I lose money on videos because of the fuel it costs me to go and do them, but still, I'm not going to stop doing it anytime soon, and I love making these videos. So of course stick around in 2022 for even more, and thank you for a great 2021 season. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.